Hello everyone, welcome to another tutorial video where I'm going to show you how to create this enemy spawner system where you could have multiple different enemies spawning in bunches, and we're going to be setting up a collision trigger which is going to control which enemy is going to spawn where and how many of those enemies are going to spawn in each of these zones. You'll be able to easily customize this just by selecting the drop-down menu and adjusting the amount of enemies that you want in the game, and it will immediately translate to the game. Without any delay, let's get into it and let me show you how this is done. For this tutorial series, we will be using the Paragon Minions pack that I downloaded from Fab, and we'll be using all the animation and the characters from this pack to populate our entire enemy system. So let's get started. Now we're going to go to our content drawer, and in the core, we're going to right click and then create a new folder for enemy system. So we're going to name this enemy_system. And we're going to have multiple different type of enemies here. We're going to have the melee enemy, we're going to have a range enemy, and we're going to have boss and such, the special enemies, I would say. So we're going to create a new folder for our melee enemy first. So I'm going to name this melee and just press enter. Inside of this melee enemy, I'm going to go ahead and right click and select a blueprint class of type character. And this, we're going to name this BP_enemy_melee. Open this up, and in our skeletal mesh, we're going to search for minion, lane, melee, core, done. It doesn't matter which one you actually select. Just one of this melee character that is core would do the trick. Select the character and set its location to -88. So it sits right at the bottom of the capsule. And then rotation, we're going to select the rotation. And then on the Z-axis, we're going to just do a -90 rotation. Compile and save. This is more of a placeholder than anything else. So now we're going to go back to our melee class, right click, and then we need to create a animation blueprint for this. So first we need to identify what is the actual skeleton that this skeletal mesh is using. So select this file icon. That'll take you to where this skeletal mesh is. And if you double click it, and if you select the skeleton, you would actually get to the skeleton. This is using the minion lane core skeleton as its main skeleton, and we're going to create a animation blueprint for the skeleton. So we're going to go back to our melee folder, right click, animation, animation blueprint. And we're going to search for minion lane core skeleton. Create. This would be for ABP_minion lane_melee. Now we need a blend space for our actual melee enemies so that we can put in our idle and move and all of the animations in there. So we're going to create a new one. Right click and then select animation. Under animation, there is an option for blend space. And again, we need to select the skeleton. So we're going to go minion_lane_core skeleton. This one's going to be BS for blend space _minion_lane_melee. Then we're going to click on Save All to make sure everything is saved. We're going to open up our blend space, and our blend space looks like this. It has a little graph where you can actually input axis, and then based on the axis, you can have different animations play. The common axis that we use is speed and direction, and that's what we're going to be using here as well. On the horizontal axis, I'm going to name this direction. That's the axis at the bottom here, and then make this direction go from -180 all the way up to 180. So you see -180 here, and then 180 at all the way on the right side. Grid divisions, we're going to leave it at 4, and we're also going to select snap to grid. In our vertical axis, we're going to name this speed. Minimum axis value is at 0, and the maximum speed that this character can go is 600. Again, you can choose to make this 800 or 700 or any number of your choice. I'm just going to make the 600 because that's the speed of the character, and I'm going to leave it consistent. And also, snap to grid and save. Now we need to populate this grid with the animations. First animation that I'm going to populate it is with the idle animation. There is a non-combat idle animation for the sword. Now remember, this idle animation also shows you the ranged animation as well. So you got to select the one that is the non-ranged one, the melee one. So, and then you're going to drop this idle here, and all the grid points here, we're going to have to drop our idle animation. This is to say that if the speed is ever to be at 0, then the enemy is going to be in an idle animation. Regardless of what direction it's facing, it's going to be in the idle animation. Next animation that we're going to search for is jog. And this character actually has a non-combat jog forward, non-combat jog forward A and B. There's 3 different non-combat jogs. So we're going to go ahead and put the non-combat jog forward here and the jog forward A and then jog forward B at the very, very top. What this is going to do is if I hold down control and then hover my mouse at the bottom point, that will put us at idle. And as I go up, you'll notice that our speed is increasing and the character is switching between different animations, blending between different animations. And this is what a blend space does. It takes multiple different animations and blends it so it's very much smooth. I'm going to take our left non-combat and put it in the left point here. And same thing here, I'm going to drop it all the way to the top. And then the right non-combat, I will drop it here and all the way to the top and also one right here. So now if I hold control and if I hover, this is going straight and this one's going to make the character turn left and this one's going to make the character turn right. And I also need to put in the right combat on this top corner and the left non-combat on the top here. So this will make it so the character is constantly going to be running. That's our speed and such. I'm going to add a couple more. Right combat, I'm going to put it in here and the left non-combat over here as well. So the entire map is filled out. So the character actually has proper animations throughout the entire direction. And at the bottom, the player is going to be idle. And that's all we're going to do for our blend space here. I'm going to save this and then close it. Now go back to our animation blueprint that we just created. I'm going to drag and drop this blend space into the animation blueprint. And now it requires a speed and a direction node here. Before that, I'm going to right click and then say default slot. When I search for default slot, I'll get a slot default slot. What this allows us to do is allows us to play montages using this rather than having to do states. We can directly start playing montages. And when I connect this here, you'll notice that the enemy is already at the idle state. Now we need to just get the direction and the speed from the blueprint, from the actual character blueprint, instead of having to set it up manually. To do this, we're going to go to the event graph. Off of our try get pawn owner, we're going to say get velocity. Get the velocity of the character, of the pawn here. And then the velocity, we need to take the vector length of the velocity. And this would give us the speed of the character. So we're going to now drag off of this and say promote to variable and connect this to this update animation and move this out. So that will set up our speed. And to calculate our direction, which we need, I'm going to right click and say calculate direction. There's an actual node for it, which requires a velocity and a base rotation. We already have velocity here, so I'm just going to plug this in here. For our rotation, we're going to drag off of this try get pawn owner and say get actor rotation. And then drag this into our base rotation. And this, I'm going to drag and say promote to variable. And this would be direction. And connect this and compile and you'll see this running. Now in our anim graph, I'm going to drag this direction and then connect it to the direction. And the speed, I didn't name it as speed. So let's go ahead and name the speed. And then connect it into the speed here. And that's all we're going to do for the animation blueprint for now. We can go ahead and close this animation blueprint. We don't need the skeleton or the skeletal mesh. Back in our enemy melee, we're going to go ahead and select our ABP minion lane melee. And you'll notice that the character will now come to life. In our Paragon minion pack that we just downloaded, we have a total of 5 different type of melee characters, but only 4 of them uses that minion lane skeleton, and this minion melee uses a completely different skeleton. We currently have 4 different type of minion lane melee skeletal mesh that we can utilize with this exact same blueprint without having to change it and just changing the skeletal mesh. So we're going to create a code for us to actually select any of these 4 minion lane meshes that is sharing the actual skeleton. This minion melee is not actually sharing the skeleton, so we won't be able to use the same animation instant class, but we should be able to use all these 4. So to do that, we're going to go to our enemy system. We're going to go ahead and create a new folder and name this blueprints. Inside of this blueprints, I'm going to right click and search a structure. This structure is going to be named enemy s underscore enemy info. And I'm going to open up the structure. And the first thing that we need to add to our structure is the type of enemy. We're going to have ranged enemy, melee enemy, boss enemy, special enemies and stuff. So we need a type. We don't want to manually type in one by one, and we won't be able to. So we're going to create an enumeration to manage that list. So we're going to right click in that folder, blueprints folder. We're going to go ahead and search for an enumeration. Select the enumeration, name it E underscore enemy type. Open this, and then we're going to add couple enumeration here. First one's going to be melee. The second one is going to be ranged. Third one is going to be like a boss. And the fourth one is going to be a special. Again, we're going to come back and change this later on as we build this system. But for now, this should do the trick. We're going to save and we're going to close this enumeration. And in this type, we're going to go ahead and select E underscore enemy type, that enumeration that we just created. We can actually name this enemy type. There you go, just to be more clear. And here we're going to also set up our skeletal mesh. This would be of type skeletal mesh. And again, we're going to use this structure for all the enemies. So that's why we're putting in this skeletal mesh and also the animation class that we'll be selecting. This is not going to be specifically for the melee enemy alone. And we're going to create a new class and then a new variable. And this would be animation class. And this should be of type anim instance and not object reference. Make sure you select class reference for the anim instance. Now we go ahead and save this. Now in our content drawer, back in our blueprints, we're going to right click and then search for data table. In this data table, we're going to go ahead and select our enemy info as our row structure and press OK. Name this as dt underscore enemy info and then save. And open up our dt enemy info data table, add in a line. The first line, we're going to leave it at melee. And the skeletal mesh that we're going to be using is our minion underscore lane. And you can see if I search for melee, there's the 4 minion lane melee. And we're going to create each line for one line for each and every single skeletal mesh that we have. Now I have set up all the 4 skeletal mesh that is available with that specific skeletal mesh, and also the same animation blueprint can be applied for all 4 of them. Now in our BP enemy melee, how this is going to work is we're going to go ahead and create a new variable, and we're going to name this enemy info. And this would be of type our structure. So that would be s underscore enemy info structure. And make sure when you compile it, select the enemy info and make this instance editable and also expose it on spawn. Compile and save. So we can edit this information from other blueprints. In our construction script, we're going to go ahead and grab our mesh component. And we're going to also go and say set skeletal mesh asset. Connect this in here. We're going to drag our enemy info. Get enemy info, drag off of this and say break as enemy info. And this skeletal mesh, we're going to go ahead and connect it in here. And again, get our mesh again. You can drag off of this or get another mesh, doesn't really matter. And say set anim instance class. Connect this over here and then get our animation instance class and then connect it here. Now, if you compile and go to your viewport, you won't see anything anymore because we have set this up in a construction script. We need to define this, and only when the actual enemy spawns in, you would see this. And this is why we didn't really care about selecting any of the skeletal mesh over here. And even now, I can go ahead and then get rid of this. And then also the animation blueprint, I can say none. I have went ahead and I replicated the same process that I used for the melee enemy to create the ranged enemy, the special enemy, and also the boss. Additionally, I have also updated the data table to show all the 4 melee enemy skeletal mesh and also the 4 ranged enemy skeletal mesh, the 1 boss enemy, and the 1 special enemy that I have. We had previously created a blueprint with the construction script for each and every single character for melee and also the ranged. We did this for testing purposes, so we no longer need this because we now have a full list of enemies, including boss and also special enemies that we want to be able to spawn in. So I'm going to go ahead into the ranged and then delete this ranged blueprint and then go into the melee, and I'm going to actually move the melee one outside to the main enemy system. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this as VP underscore enemy spawner. Now the spawner is going to have the exact same function. It's going to get in the enemy info and it's going to spawn in. So this is what we're going to be using to spawn in our different type of enemies. We just need to set up the skeletal mesh in the anim instance, and then it would actually go ahead and spawn in. Now we need a way to spawn in these specific enemies. For that, I think the best way to do it is using triggers, collision triggers. And then when we want to spawn in a specific enemy type, we'll just drag and drop that collision trigger in the map and set up the radius of that collision trigger, and then the enemy should spawn within it. To do that, we're going to go ahead and right click and say go to blueprint class and type of actor and name it BP underscore enemy spawn trigger. Open this enemy spawn trigger. Inside of this, we're going to add a box collision and name this spawn area. Compile and save. We want to make sure that our spawn area is thin, 0.15, just like that. And then you can now extend this area to however you would like. We want to be able to get a random point from this box and then spawn our enemy inside of this. So a couple things we need here. We need to know what type of enemy that's going to be spawning here and how many enemies we're going to be spawning here. So we're going to create a variable for those. So first is enemy type. And this would be of type E underscore enemy type, our enumeration that we previously created. I'm going to make this instance editable and also expose on spawn. The second one is we're going to make a count, and this would be our integer. This is to tell the spawner how many enemies we need to spawn in. First, we want to get random points within this box to be able to spawn the enemy. So I'm going to drag this trigger in. And first I'm going to do is get world location. So this will get the center point of the actual trigger. And then I'm also going to get this trigger out and then say get scaled box and extent. This will get me the box dimensions. And now I can use these two. I can get random point in bounding box. When I select this, it's going to ask me what's the center. I'm going to get the world location and then plug it into the center, and then get the scaled box extent to plug it into the half size. And this is going to be my spawn location. I can promote this to a variable and say spawn location. Now, I don't want this to be on the event begin play. I'm going to make this into a function. So I'm going to select all of it, right click and say collapse to function. And the function name would be get spawn location. We can put in get random spawn location. Now, we also want to get random spawn locations multiple times, because if the enemy count is only 1, then one location is good. But if the enemy count is 10, we don't want all the enemies to spawn in on the same location. So we're going to get our count, and we're going to do a for loop. And our first index is going to be at 0, and the last index is going to be at the count. So we should make a count subtract 1. Plug this into the last index. So for each of the count, we're going to get a random new location. And then this is going to set the spawn location, right? So we're going to get our spawn location here. And we also want to now filter out the enemy type. So we want to get our enemy type here and then do a switch function on it. We're going to delete the spawn location for now, just a moment, and then we'll get back to it. Now, when the player is telling this spawn trigger to spawn an enemy, the player needs to define which type of enemy needs to be spawning in. We're going to do a filter function on the actual data table. We're going to go ahead and create a new function, and we're going to say filter dt underscore filter underscore melee. In this function, I'm going to go ahead and say get data table row names, and do a for each loop. Connect this array. get the array element, and then get data table row. Again, select the enemy info as the asset for both. And we're going to check to see if this enemy type equals to melee. So break, and then this enemy type, that will be equal, and then there will be an enum equal. And if this enemy type equals melee, branch, found, then we're going to create an array with this array element so we can get all of it. So first I'm going to go ahead and drag this and say promote to a variable. And this will create an array element. And then we're going to name this melee array. And then also delete this now. And then select the melee array and then make it into a type array. Now I can go ahead and drag this and say get melee array and then add off of true. And the item that we're adding is the actual array element. Compile and save. So what this is going to do is when we call in this function, it's going to go ahead and filter out the data table row and check every single one of them. And if they have the enemy type set to melee, then it's going to add it to the melee array. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to go ahead and duplicate this and then name this ranged. And here we're going to go ahead and change this to ranged. And this melee array, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste so I can get another one. So I'm duplicating this, and then I'm going to call this ranged array. And I can go ahead and delete this melee array and then connect this ranged array. I'm going to do the same thing for the boss and the special. So now we have effectively filtered out our data table to each individual enemy class type. So now back in our switch function in our enemy type, off of melee, what we're going to do is first we're going to go ahead and call out the DT melee filter. And if it is ranged, then we want to make it a ranged filter. And if it is boss, we'll do the same thing. And also for the special, we'll do the special one. Once you have done this, now we need to create a function to actually spawn in these enemy. And we want to create one function that should be able to handle the spawning of the enemy and also the location. So we're going to create a new function and say spawn enemy. The input of this spawn enemy would be would require a row name, and this would be of type name, and also it would be an array. So basically, it's one of these arrays. We're going to send it in, and then also it would require a location. And we're going to name this type vector, an individual vector. So off of our row name, we're going to drag it, and we're going to say random array item. So it's going to grab a random item. And again, you can choose to select a specific one, but I'm going to choose random for the purpose of this tutorial. And I'm going to say get data table row and select the DT enemy info. Plug this in. And off of this row found, we need to now call in this enemy spawner. So I'm going to go ahead and say spawn actor from class. We need to select our class, which would be BP underscore enemy spawner. And I have the enemy info, which I can plug in here. And this spawn transform, I'm going to right click and then split it so I can get the location, rotation, and scale. And this location, we actually entered in a location here because we are going to be getting a location as soon as we get a random spawn point here. So every time this loop runs, it's going to get a different random spawn point. So off of here, we're going to go ahead and say spawn enemy and then connect this in here. We're going to get our spawn location, connect this here, and then get our melee array and then connect this here. And in our spawn enemy, we're going to take this location and then I'm going to go ahead and plug this in like this. We're going to do the same thing, but for each and every single one of these enemy class. So this is our spawn trigger setup. And now we just need to call in the spawn trigger or set this up when we are spawning them in. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the game and then drag our spawn trigger just like here. And then I'm going to extend this out. I'm going to extend it so that it's not clipping within a mesh or any type of static mesh or anything so that the enemy can safely spawn in. And also I want to make sure that this is not underneath the ground. And now I can select this spawn trigger, and here on the detail panel, I have the enemy type And also I need to make the count instance editable here. Select the count, make it instance editable, and also expose on spawn, save. And now if I go in here, I have the type and the enemy count. So if I make this 10 and then set it to melee, and then if I press play, you'll notice that there are 10 enemies that have actually spawned in here. If you want to expand this, all you have to do is just take this enemy spawner and then make a duplicate of it, and then you can go ahead and then put it somewhere around here. We can make this into like the ranged enemy and then make it 10. You'll notice there's your boss, your melee, and then also your actual ranged enemies as well. So folks, thank you very much for watching this tutorial of how to create this enemy spawner and also create a trigger where the enemy will spawn within. Good luck with this, and I hope you like this video tutorial series. If you do, please let me know in the comment section that you do like it so I can keep creating more and more tutorial series just like this. Feel free to subscribe to the channel as you'll be notified as soon as my next tutorial series gets released. Until then, have yourself a wonderful evening.